Thank you, Brother David. Well, good morning, dearly beloved brothers and sisters in Jesus, our Lord. You know, each Sunday we come together, don't we, to break bread and to drink wine. We come to remember the Lord's sacrifice that's on the table in front of us. But what's interesting is that we often read, just before the emblems, a passage that takes us back to Christ in the upper room. And it's in Paul's words in 1 Corinthians that we often go to, in a sense, focus our minds on what we are really all about here on a Sunday morning. And it's interesting in 1 Corinthians 11, and we've probably read it week in, week out, that Paul says these words, "But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup." Just ponder that for a moment, brothers and sisters. Examine ourselves. What does that actually mean? Because before we partake of the bread and wine, that's actually something that we should all be doing very carefully. But if we stop and consider for a moment, self-examination, we kind of think, well, is that actually a good idea? Because when you start to conduct a self-review, surely there's a conflict of interest in that. For instance, if I was to ask, about Brother David, whether he's a lovely gentleman, I could actually ask him and he'll of course nod and give me, of course I am. We could ask his wife as well and she'll of course, oh, okay. But again, I'd be asking someone very close to him, and in doing so, people might go, yeah, but that's a biased response. You see, brothers and sisters, the issue with a conflict of interest is that a conflict of interest is a situation where the concerns and the interests of the two people are actually incompatible. And the reason for that is because the person is actually in a position to judge based on gaining some personally derived benefit from the situation. So that therefore the decisions or the actions that are made might be influenced or biased by their own personal perspective and how it would suit them. You see, if we were to truly self-examine, if we have to do something that comes from that judgment that we may not really like, then we might sort of tone down the judgment a little bit because it suits us in here. And that's the very situation, brothers and sisters, that self-examination places us in. Because if we look inside, if we examine self at that moment, then we will see very clearly that the aims and interests of man's heart is totally incompatible with the aims and interests of God. And if, brothers and sisters, when we're actually trying to make a judgment, the position that we could place self in might influence the judgments that we would gain, because we might derive some sort of personal benefit from the actions by which we decide upon. So, brothers and sisters, is it a good idea to do a self-review? Now, to put this in the business world, if you were to go through a review process, and you might in your job have a review process for whatever you do, but I know I do in my job. If you ever have a review, it's always done by someone externally. They might sit you down and ask you to answer a few questions, but really you know that you're going to have to possibly answer them a little bit more honestly, because someone else outside of you is going to give an analysis of you. It's always someone external. In fact, business today would look at what's called a 360 review. Not only would those above you review you, but those beneath you would review as well, because they want to get the complete picture. It's easy to sort of, I suppose, suck up to the boss and show the boss a position that you're doing, but other people might not have that perspective of you. So when you conduct a review, brothers and sisters, it's generally someone external to you that will do that. And the reason is that as I began thinking about this idea of what we come together to do every Sunday, it began to teach me how insidious self really is in all that we think and all that we do, and how hard it is to stop and truly self-reflect as we partake of the emblems, because there is not only a conflict of interest, but we live in a world, brothers and sisters, that self is all around us, and it's impinging upon everything that we do. We live in a world today that's so preoccupied with self and personal affairs that it is actually hard to even see sometimes where self is coming in. Now, if you think about the world in which we live in today, think about how the world is becoming so much more individualistic. The world is talking about, the opposite of collectivism. It's talking about how independent and self-reliant and self-centered we should be. Everything around us is about challenging the absolutes. Everything around us is that there's no objective moral truth. Really, it's your opinion and my opinion. Truth is no longer something that comes from an external source. Truth is something that you decide for yourself what you think is right or wrong. More than ever, people are rejecting rules and traditions. They're far less interested in how it was done in the past. They're far more interested in how it works for them now. Do you know what's interesting is that there was a national study of youth and religion, and it found that the guiding morality of over 60% of millennials was simply that they would just be able to feel what was right. That's the modern generation that we live in today. In fact, self now actually has a platform for expression. It's called social media. Your social media account, you can tell everyone about you. You can even tell people what you had for breakfast, what you achieved at the run and the gym. I don't tell many people about that. And what you've virtually bought from the shops. You can tell everyone about your new car, your new house. You can tell everyone about your opinion. And more than that, your opinion now is no longer considered slanderous or imbalanced or inaccurate. Your opinion is actually seen as being more important because you can give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Brothers and sisters, now it's no longer speaking evil of others. Really, you know better. And this self-focus, brothers and sisters, I believe is becoming part of not only the world around us, but us as well. People are lacking the kind of empathy to see it from another person's perspective. All they see is themselves. And this quest for materialism, this quest for economic individualism is actually being driven in more economically strong countries than it is in other countries that really have nothing much at all. In fact, I chatted to some of the kids in my class the other day, and I asked them a question. I said, when you leave school, what is it that you want? And most of them actually said that they wanted to be comfortable. And when I started to dig, I said, what does it mean to be comfortable? Soon, the idea of being comfortable means to be well off financially. That's the goal of most people today, to have it all and to have it now. And therefore, what's driving most people is me. And that comes even into family life. No longer do we have parenting, we have parenting. We indulge kids in what they desire. Less and less emphasis is being placed on hard work and respect for others, empathy, taking responsibility, cooperation, things like sharing and earning your stripes. Now we have a generation where you get a trophy for just going in the competition. Brothers and sisters, it's all about us. And in fact, most TV shows now are really just documentaries on narcissists. But that's what our world portrays as being what everyone wants. And yet we're struggling, brothers and sisters. We're struggling in a world that is so focused with self, that now even biological terms like male and female are undone because you can identify with whatever you like. But the sad thing is we're even moving further and further away from God, because no longer can we see the God of the Old Testament as matching our lifestyle today. See, the God of the Old Testament must be a malicious and destructive God who, loves slavery and genocide. And further, our view and our opinion of God really makes him incompatible with the way we view anything that has to do with religion today. More and more people are actually deciding their own religion than being part of a basic, religion of itself. You see, brothers and sisters, this is the struggle that our generation is finding in, and we are all part of that. All of that is self gone crazy, and self is the problem, and it's inside of us. And you know what, brothers and sisters, we often think that, is the world getting worse? No, there's nothing new under the sun. We know that Christ said that the days of his return would be the days of Noah and the days of Lot. Now take yourself back into Sodom and Gomorrah. Isn't it interesting that even Lot, as he stood in there trying to tell the people of his generation not to do so wickedly, they would turn on him and say, "Who made you a judge over us?" Isn't that the catch cry of our generation? Don't judge me. You don't have any right to judge me. Well, brothers and sisters, there is a God in heaven who is the source of all truth and all righteousness. And the thing that we have to be aware of is that self is so insidious, it can get into every one of us. And I'd like you to just come and have a look at 2 Timothy for a moment, brothers and sisters, because here is a passage we know really well. And we often look at it in terms of preaching and saying, look at how the world is. But the sad thing about this quote is it's not talking about the world. Here in 2 Timothy chapter 3, we know that in the last times, perilous times will come. But look at the emphasis. And I'm going to read it from the ESV. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. What's the times of difficulty? People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unfeeling, uncooperative, slanderous, degenerate, brutal, hateful of what is good, traitors, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having an appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Now stop and think for a moment, brothers and sisters. Is that the world? No, it's not. That's the ecclesia. This is a picture of the ecclesia where we're going to be lovers of ourselves more than lovers of God, where sometimes we can deny the true power of what we've come to do every Sunday. Because if we come to examine ourselves truly, then brothers and sisters, we've got to realize that there's the problem. It's easy to point and say, well, God, I thank you that I'm not like that out there in the world. Or do we come here and put our hand across our chest and say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner? Here we are, bound up with the same problem, brothers and sisters, because self is in every one of us. And in our reading from Philippians chapter 3 this morning, just come back there, this verse came home to me like an absolute sledgehammer. And I've never thought of it before in this context. And in fact, brothers and sisters, I could understand why it says in this chapter that Paul actually warned them with tears. With tears. He was crying, brothers and sisters, because he saw the enemy within each of us. Now have a look at verse 17. He goes, brethren, be followers together of me. Be careful of those who walk after a different way, but be careful of us who walk as an example. But look at verse 18. For some walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ. Brothers and sisters, it doesn't say they're saying a few things that are a bit out of line. Paul is saying that these people within the ecclesia are the enemy of everything that Christ came to destroy. That is very powerful. That such was what was going on here in the ecclesia, that Paul had to write and warn them with tears that these people were actually setting themselves up as the enemy of that cross. That's not the world, brothers and sisters. That's in the ecclesia. And Paul's warning them of that. And you can actually see that it's their belly, taking us back, of course, to Genesis 3:15, whose glory is in their shame. What's the issue? Is that they mind earthly things. Now, we have a wonderful example of that in the Bible, and I'm going to use the Apostle Peter, brothers and sisters, to take us through a little bit of self-examination. Do you know, I love Peter. Peter in the scriptures was this brash, but yet, I suppose impertinent at times, but yet he came out with some of the most beautiful acknowledgements of faith. And I see a lot, I suppose, of myself in him because, he sometimes wants to go in and fight the fights, and you don't always have, the thinking of the Spirit to do it in the right way. And Peter is exactly that. But let's come back to look at Peter in the Gospels. And we're going to finish with Peter in his epistles to see how we can all go through this transition that he did. But just come with me to Mark chapter 8 for a moment, and let's see Peter in his brash, self-focused moment. See, here in Mark chapter 8, in order to explain this idea of the enemies of the cross of Christ, Peter is a classic example of this. Here in Mark chapter 8, let's just start at verse 31. that Jesus began to teach them and say, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And you'd think, wouldn't you, that of all the people there with Jesus, his disciples would have understood that. Of all the people, it would have been those closest to him. But Peter took him and began to rebuke him. And he said, that's just not going to happen, Lord. And if we read from the Matthew 16 record, it actually says, Lord, pity yourself. Lord, think about yourself for a minute. Surely you don't have to go through this, being killed and rise again. Tone it down a little bit. But Jesus, when he turned about, looked on his disciples. And I want you to remember that. We're going to come back to that point. He looked on the rest of the disciples and he said, Peter, get behind me, Satan, for you savor not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. Wow, how cutting is that? He had to pull Peter down to size, brothers and sisters. And the reason being is because what motivated that comment by Peter was self-preservation. Because if Christ had to suffer, so too Peter would suffer as a disciple. So in order to tell Christ to pity himself, really what was motivating it is his own self. And the reason that Christ was so strong in rebuking him, brothers and sisters, is because at that moment, his thinking upon man was an enemy of the cross of Christ. He stood in the way and said, you will not have to do that. And so there is that very stern rebuke, brothers and sisters, because Christ knew that the cross meant denying self. I'm not going to pity myself. I have to deny self. I have to cut self off. And so, brothers and sisters, Christ goes on to say, if you want to gain your life now, then you're going to lose it eternally. But if you are losing yourself now, you will gain eternity. You will gain the kingdom. There's the black and white nature of that. And that's exactly, brothers and sisters, the point that Paul is making back in Philippians chapter 3. Just come back and have a look at the first part of this chapter that we read. You see, in the early part of this chapter, from verse 4, Paul puts forward all his credentials that he could be confident in according to the flesh. So in Philippians 3, of everything that the Jew stood for, in all his confidence and trust, here he was, circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. As touching the law, he was a Pharisee. If you wanted to see his zeal, well, he persecuted the ecclesia. As touching the righteousness which is of law, he was blameless. But brothers and sisters, all of that was self. All it was is wearing the right things, doing the right things for other people to see. It all became the praise of men. There was nothing inside that was actually going on here. There was actually no real attack on the true problem that man had, and that is the heart of man. And that's why he says in verse 7, of everything that I saw, there was gain in man's way of looking at things. I had to count it but loss. I had to cut it off. I had to get rid of it. Because if I didn't, then I wouldn't be able to gain the wonderful things that were in Christ. And so he says, yea, doubtless I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. And guess what? I count them as dung, because I have something so much better. Brothers and sisters, when we examine ourselves and the things that we want to cling on to, do we judge it in light of eternity? The little parts of our life that we want to hold on to it and actually think that they're okay. Christ is saying that they should sometimes be put on a cross and hung there, because that's what self really deserves. Count them as dung to gain Christ. And that's why when we look at passages like Romans 6, the baptism chapter, it's a chapter about being conformed to Christ. And we're conformed to Christ, brothers and sisters, when we do what Christ did. We put the body of sin to death. And that's why he says we're conformable to his death, because it's in that we see the destruction of self. But the beautiful thing is, if we're conformable to that in his death, then Paul goes on to say that we will in the likeness of his resurrection rise again. If we're willing to take up our cross and follow him through that, in that true self-examination, then brothers and sisters, we will rise with him at another day. And that's why if we think about why Christ was so strong in reacting to Peter, ask yourself the question, why was he so, powerful in his rebuke? Not just because he had to settle Peter and help Peter, but brothers and sisters, because Christ felt that. He felt the temptation to pity yourself. That's the strongest urge that we all have, to go easy on self. And sometimes no one else would ever know. But God knows, and that was the difference. And so that's why when we align ourselves with this man, then as Galatians 2 says, we're crucified with Christ. And yet we live because we live Christ's life now. We don't live after the life of the flesh, because that's a life we want to put away. But we live by the faith of the Son of God who loves us and who gave himself for us. Now, brothers and sisters, just come back with me to 1 Corinthians 11 for a moment, because when we talk about the cross of Christ, there's actually two significant elements in it. And I want you to think about what we started with back in Mark chapter 8. Because here in 1 Corinthians 11, when we're called upon to self-examine, we often think about the cross of Christ being a putting away of sin and of self. But just have a look at these verses here, starting at verse 23 in 1 Corinthians 11. He goes, "For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me.'" Now, did you notice those two significant elements there? The first one, brothers and sisters, is on the same night in which he was betrayed, he took bread. You see, the night in which Christ was betrayed, brothers and sisters, was the night of the upper room. And in the upper room, brothers and sisters, they all gathered around, and the Lord asked this question in the middle of the Passover. He threw it out there, and he said, "One of you will betray me." Now, if you were there, brothers and sisters, you would have had to immediately self-examine. And that's what they all did. They all had to stop and go, "Well, is it I? Is it me?" They all had to pause and look inwardly for a moment. And it's actually interesting that in the Gospels that it tells us that it was round about the time in the upper room where they're all discussing who would be the greatest. So here they were focused on themselves. And the reason why Christ threw that into the mix was to stop them thinking about themselves and to turn and actually look inwardly as to whether they had betrayed him. Were they thinking on earthly things, or were they thinking on heavenly things? And so they did. It actually says they were exceedingly sorrowful in Matthew 26 and began everyone to say, "Lord, is it I?" So it did bring about that effect of self-examination, because we need to do that as well, brothers and sisters. We come here to see whether during the week we have been serving self or whether we have been serving our master. Because do you know the difference between those two? If we're serving self, we're betraying the very one that we come to follow. And when we see it like that, that hurts, because that's the black and white view of self-examination. But the other element here, brothers and sisters, is in verse 24. You see, Jesus gave thanks for that bread on that night. And do you know what he gave thanks for? He gave thanks for his body being broken for them. You see, the other element in that is not just putting away self, it's actually doing something for others. That's why back in Mark chapter 8, brothers and sisters, Christ turned around when Peter said that and he looked on his disciples. Because Peter didn't realize at that time that his comment was not only selfish, but it was not thinking about the views and the needs of all the other disciples that were around him. It was an elevating comment above the rest. And therefore, he was not thinking about their needs. Do you know why, brothers and sisters? Because Jesus died to save them. And to stand in his way was to stop the salvation of those who were there around him. And he had to see it like that. He had to see that the Lord and Master came into the world to save him and them. His act was an act of sacrifice for them. And that's why it says in Matthew 26, this is the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. There is the motive by which Christ lived his life. So when we talk about self-examination, brothers and sisters, it's not about examining self to ensure that we've got rid of self. It's about examining ourselves to see whether we're here serving one another, whether our life is dedicated to each other, to upholding the principles of the Lord's sacrifice. And that's why he says in verse 26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you show the Lord's death. So we're here to proclaim that to each other, to proclaim our life of service to one another. So it's not just dealing with sin and self in our own life. We come here to dedicate our lives and to give our lives to each other and to say that I am here for you, brother and sister, for your struggles, for your trials. And we need to be there with an outward focus, not an inward one. And that's why, brothers and sisters, the power of this verse, if we look at verse 27, wherefore whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. What does it mean, unworthily? Like, we're all unworthy. But what he's saying, brothers and sisters, is he's taking us back to the upper room, back to that moment where they are all gathered together and saying, go back there and see what that principle was. So just hold your hand in 1 Corinthians 11. Just quickly come back to John chapter 13 for a moment. And let's just go to Christ in the upper room, because I really want us to follow Peter now through this and see the lesson that Peter learned in his life. You see, brothers and sisters, this chapter is a chapter where Christ showed them the standard of discipleship, if you will. So we know in John chapter 13, it tells us that Jesus knew that the hour was come that he would depart from the Father, having loved his own, which are in the world. And he loved them, brothers and sisters, to the utmost. Here's the background of the upper room. His love for them. He was coming to gather them together that he might show them the depth of his love. And so in verse 2, it says, while the supper was ongoing, the devil or sin having entered into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, that he was come from God and he went to God. In other words, brothers and sisters, we could look at that and go, although Jesus was clearly the greatest amongst them, here the greatest would stand up in the middle of that supper. And I love this phrase, and I want you to note it down because we're going to find it in 1 Peter, that he laid aside his garments. That's not just telling us that he took his clothes off. That's saying that everything that was him, of all of his self, he laid it off. He put it aside. Because even though he was the greatest there amongst them, he was going to be their servant. He was going to serve them there in the very midst of that. Even though Judas, in his heart, was profiting on self, here was the one contrasted beautifully, though could claim to be the greatest, would be the lowest amongst them. And so he takes this towel and he girds himself. Now, brothers and sisters, Peter picks all these phrases up. He picks them all up in 1 Peter. And his mind is here because he's watching his Lord show him what self-sacrifice truly is. He pours out the water and he washes their feet. Now, brothers and sisters, we get an indication of what it means to eat and drink unworthily because we see Judas here as the example of that. Judas, if we have a look in verse 27, it says, and after the sop, Satan entered into him and he goes out and Jesus says, whatever you do, do quickly. He was a person focused on what his own gain was, but contrasted to the one who came to serve others in the upper room. And that's exactly what he did. Look at verse 12. He washed their feet. And he goes, do you know what I've done? He goes, you call me Lord and Master. And he goes, so I am. But you need to understand that if I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, so ought you to wash one another's feet. This is the standard of my love that must be seen amongst you. This is the love of the new commandment that I give unto you. And that's what he goes on to show after Judas leaves in verses 33, 34, all the way on. He goes, this is the new commandment, that as I have loved you, so you might love each other. So it's not a new commandment, brothers and sisters, in the sense that it should have been new to them. It was a new standard lived out in this man's life of how they should be serving each other. And by this, he says, all men will know. So when people come amongst us, brothers and sisters, do they see Christ? Because this is the standard of our service, one to another. Well, verse 36 is our Simon Peter. Simon Peter says, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus says, well, actually, where I go, you can't follow me now, but you will follow me afterwards. And so Peter, in his brash way, stands up and says in verse 37, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'm going to lay down my life for you. And of course, Peter has to be put in his place again, brothers and sisters, because what was motivating that comment in front of everyone was self. And the real point of self-reflection, brothers and sisters, right at this moment, was for him to realize that Christ was the one who was laying down his life. And to follow him meant that he had to start with self and to eradicate self from him. So when we come to 1 Corinthians 11, just come back there, brothers and sisters, that's the point of verse 28. Let a man examine himself. There's the power, brothers and sisters, of what we come to do every Sunday. It must be in light of what our Master showed. We proclaim the Lord's death, but more than that, he that eats and drinks unworthily eats and drinks condemnation to himself. Notice this, not discerning the Lord's body. Brothers and sisters, we are the Lord's body. And we ought to be discerning of our own actions in light of our brothers and sisters. We ought to be there serving one another, caring for one another, reaching out to one another. Because, brothers and sisters, that's how we discern the needs of the body ahead of our own. And we place the needs of others before ourselves. Because that's the standard of Christ's sacrifice that he gave them in John chapter 13. That, brothers and sisters, is the caring of his body that he was looking for. Now, just come with me to 1 Peter for a moment, because let's see how Peter, as an older, reflective man, saw the power of his Lord's example and the work that he was taught on those nights. And we don't have time to look at Peter, but you know what? Peter is an amazing character. The thing I love about Peter is he writes an entire, book pretty much picking out all the things he got wrong. And he embeds it all in there. Do you know you can trust people, I reckon, when they're willing to admit their faults? And Peter is a book of just laying out in front of us all the things that I think he got wrong and how Christ taught him. I love this. Just look at just a few examples. 1 Peter 2. Wherefore, laying aside all malice and guile and hypocrisies and envies and all evil speaking. Do you hear that phrase? Laying aside. Do you know that's exactly the same phrase as John 13, verse 3? That he laid aside his garment. Identical phrase. Peter picks it up, and in his exhortation to the ecclesia, he says, think back on that night. There is the example of laying aside self. Get rid of malice, guile, hypocrisies, envies, evil speakings. It's all got to do with self. Eradicate it. As newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word, that we may be able to grow thereby. Isn't that beautiful, brothers and sisters? He just plucks that little example out and throws it into his record. And I'm just only going to pick 3 examples. Just have another one here and by the way, if you want to, the entire chapter, 1 Peter 2, if you keep reading, it talks about the stones and the spiritual house. Comes straight out of Matthew 16, which was one of the other times that Christ rebuked Peter. His entire exhortation about the foundation of the ecclesia, okay, and the stones being built on Christ is expounded here in 1 Peter 2. Beautiful when you just see he just molds all this stuff together. Just come across to chapter 4. Verse 1, For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. Hear the echoes of Peter? You're minding the things of the flesh, Peter. So he goes, now arm yourself with the mind of Christ. For he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men. See how he's saying, don't keep living according to self, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, but we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, abominable idolatries. And he goes through and says, this is the old way of life. But you know, I love that little phrase there. Put a little circle around the word arm there, brothers and sisters, because that word is only mentioned 5 times in the New Testament. And what the first occurrence of that word is actually in John chapter 17, where the men come out to arrest Christ. And it says that they were armed to arrest him. And it's at that incident where Peter actually tries to defend Christ and stand in the way and stop his arrest. And Christ says, stop, they've come out to get me. I'm going to go willingly. So here he does again pick up a beautiful phrase from the time where Christ had to teach him that submitting to the will of God was the most important, and to think like God, not to defend yourself. Because he could have defended himself. He could have armed himself with 12 legions of angels to protect himself, but he didn't. He armed himself with a mind that said, not my will, but yours be done, that he might put away the flesh. Just another quick example, chapter 5, just come across to verses 1 through to 5. Do you notice again, Peter always talks about the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would be revealed. There's always the sufferings and then the glory. He shows the recognition of going through this. And so here in chapter 5, he says, the elders which are among you, I exhort. Here's his humility. Because I'm also an elder, a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. So he says, feed the flock, not taking oversight, but by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre's sake, but of a ready mind. See how he's always trying to focus us on the way he should think. Neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd who shall appear, he shall receive a crown of glory that fades not away. Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yes, all of you be subject one to another. Brothers and sisters, the RSV says, gird yourselves with humility and serve one another. He's directly quoting from John 13 in the upper room. That's the standard that Peter came to understand about the work of Christ. And the reason why I love that, brothers and sisters, is because I think it teaches all of us that we all go through the struggle like Peter. We all mind earthly things. But as we come here, let's take ourselves to the upper room. Let's think about that wonderful example that Christ set there amongst them, where he demonstrated it's not just about putting self away, it's about serving one another. That's the true standard by which he set there on that night. And that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, and I'm going to read from the ESV, because in verse 31 he says, but if we judge ourselves truly, that means sometimes when we judge ourselves, we don't do it properly. When we come here, we should judge ourselves truly in light of that standard, because if when we are judged by the Lord, then brothers and sisters, we know that we're allowing his work to purge out self. So that if we judge righteously now, when he returns, he will come, brothers and sisters, and find a people who have purged themselves of sin and are there trying to gird themselves with service to their brothers and sisters. He will come to find a reflection of his own character in us. So let's see the importance of truly examining ourselves this morning, brothers and sisters. Let's take up our cross and deny self. Let's follow him. But let's realize that we need to love our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind, and our neighbor as ourself. Because on all of this hangs the law and the prophets. Let us proclaim the Lord's death till he comes, and know that if we lose our life now, we will certainly gain eternity in the kingdom.